I'd like to introduce our third speaker, and that is Anastasios Koutsos. Anastasios has had more than 5 years' experience in communications and has advised a number of pharmaceutical, biotechnological, medical technology, and venture capital firms on healthcare, corporate, financial, and marketing communications. His expertise covers a broad range of fields, including rare diseases, oncology, cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, pharmaceutical partnering, laboratory equipment, and diagnostics. Anastasios has a PhD in molecular biology and has previously worked as a scientific and journal development editor at the open access publisher Biomed Central. He has also served as a consultant for the UK Medical Research Council for 5 years.
I'm really excited to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm also quite excited that my presentation follows after Stefania's presentation because we're talking about the same thing, but slightly with different perspectives. You might also have seen that I have slightly changed the title of my presentation. Now it's called Imparting the Uncommon, Communicating the Rare. Because when I started creating this presentation, I wanted more the title to reflect what I believe is your challenge in communicating rare diseases. So if you take these sentences together, if you actually take them apart, you realize that these two sentences are actually the same. After all, imparting is another word for communicating, and uncommon is another word for rare. But I hope you agree with me that the top sentence is actually very difficult to be understood, whereas the sentence below it's much more simple. And I think this is what I believe the challenge in communicating rare diseases is. We're talking about diseases that nobody knows. They're very scientific and very complex in nature and sometimes genetic. But the problem is that we need to be able to communicate them in a very effective and very simple manner. So how can this be done? I believe that you can do this by telling a story because after all, we as humans communicate, share, and also learn through telling stories. We usually use stories to provide an emotional connection, and we use stories to provide an aspect of our lives to the lives of the others. But a very good story is usually much more than that. A good story actually has a life of its own because it can actually travel from person to person. If told really nice, a very good story is actually priceless. So what I would like you to do now is that I want you to discuss with you 3 aspects which I believe can actually help you to make your stories unique. And then I want you to go into more practical matters. How can you use your storytelling in order to your communication materials for your organization? So what does make a story unique? One aspect, I think, is emotional narrative. The ability to be able to tap into your audience's emotion. And how do you achieve emotional narrative? First, I think your story needs to have a structure. It needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it has to have a plot. But more than that, your story needs to have characters. It should be characters that people can relate to and empathize with them. And it's quite important that at some point in your story, you need to provide some form of conflict. Now, conflict can take many different forms. It can actually be something like human versus machine. It could be human versus society. But I think in our case, when we're talking about rare diseases, it's probably human versus genetics or human versus environment. But after you have introduced your conflict in your story, there has to be a turning point somewhere that from the conflict you go to resolution. And that's how you should end your story. If told really, really good by following this structure, your story is not only to be emotive, but it will also have the ability to be remembered. And as Maya Angelou said, people may forget what they have, what you have said. People will forget what you have done, but people never forget how you made them feel. Another aspect that I believe your stories should have is simplicity. And by simplicity, we mean that you should try to tell your stories the easiest and the simplest way possible, by using very simple words and trying to avoid any form of scientific jargon. But simplicity also has an additional function. When you try to tell your story in a very minimalist way, then your audience is going to construct the story in their minds. And what do I mean with that? Let's consider this small poem, which is a nun in the supermarket standing in the queue, wondering what it's like to buy groceries for two. It's a very simple story. It's very, very emotional. And what does it tell you about this person? What does the story tell you? To me, it talks about sadness and it talks about loneliness. But the story doesn't really say anything explicitly about sadness. It just provides you the setting and the framework, and it kind of allows you to kind of put it into your mind and realize where this person is and why they might be feeling that way. Moving on, I think another aspect that your story needs to have is creativity. Most of the good stories are the ones that actually appeal to the sense of wonder. Now ask yourself, has the story that I'm trying to say been told before? If your answer is yes to that, then I think you should try and find a different angle with which you can actually tell your story. And creativity here, it means exactly that. To actually examine something under a completely different light, and usually to make connections with things that are not existing. Or, as Edward de Bono said, creativity involves breaking out of established patterns in order to look at things in a different way. Now I know that you're probably lost, so I have actually chosen 2 examples of really good stories that have been told recently. It is actually from the consumer world, but I wanted to share them with you to actually show you how these principles can actually come to play. The first one is a video that was recently launched by Apple Computers during the holiday season. It was a very simple story of a young lady that goes to her grandmother's staff, and there she unearths a small record that her grandmother used to record a very small song and therefore to communicate with the loved ones. So what she does is she takes this record, she puts it into her computer, and she uses her own creativity along with the products of the company to create more or less a duet that gives to her grandmother on Christmas Day. And obviously her grandmother, once she kind of listens to that, she's kind of very emotional, and this is where basically the story ends. I don't know if you have seen this story, but to me, this story has actually all the elements that we discussed about. It has a structure, it has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a plot, it has some characters that people can relate to, a young person and an older person, and it also has a conflict. The conflict here is different forms of technologies and how we've been using technology in the past and how we're using it now. And then at the end, we have a turning point that basically says that it doesn't really matter how we were using technology before and after. All that it matters is how you basically use technology to kind of come into connection with your loved ones. The second example that I wanted to share with you is one that you might not be aware of, but if you happen to be on YouTube, please try and search for the video that says "The Man Who Walked the World." It's an advertisement that was created by Johnny Walker, and basically it is a 6-minute video that tells the story of how Johnny Walker created his eponymous brand. But what is quite interesting with that is that it involves a lot of creativity. Rather than have a boring corporate video saying how the company came into being, you have the narrative here, who is actually the protagonist of the story, who walks down a road in Scotland and basically gradually tell this story. And they use also props to actually bring this story to life. So please note it down, just try and see it on the internet. And also, obviously, these are 2 of the examples, and you can try and find more examples of very effective storytelling. To move on into more practical matters, after you have built your story, I can actually tell you, some advice on how you can actually employ your storytelling in your communication materials that you'll be using for your organization. But before we do that, I want basically to focus on two more aspects. And the first one is messaging and positioning. If you're starting fresh, you might consider doing that as one of the first steps in kind of building your organization. Positioning is usually a strategic process that you can use to actually communicate about yourself, to decide what your aims are, what your priorities are, what your audiences and ambition are, and basically your long-term goals. And after you have done this positioning, I think it's quite useful to gather your colleagues and what we do and do what we call the messaging exercise. So basically, trying to encapsulate all these values into actual words that you should be using from now on to communicate to your audiences. And this kind of forms the core messages for your organization. So if you've done that, you obviously have a name, you obviously have messages, and you've also discussed and agreed on the tone and voice that you're going to be having. And these, to me, are the first steps towards building a brand. Now, in the old times, a brand was something that was related to consumerism. But nowadays, a brand is considered an organization with a personality. Think of Amnesty International, think of Cancer Research UK. All these organizations have actually succeeded, not only because they are basically employing a very nice communication strategy, but because they're also recognizable to all of their audiences. And they're doing these by actually building a brand. You can actually notice here that Findacure and also the Anastasia Society has done the same thing. Now, try and think, what do I want my brand to convey? What are the essential elements of my brand? And try then to capture these elements of your brand also into your logo, the fonts that you're using, and even the images that you are going to be using in your communication materials. So I wanted now to focus on 4 different communication materials. I wanted to talk about press releases, backgrounders and leaflets, and websites. We'll start with press releases because I think that the press release is a unique opportunity to engage with journalists and try to tell your story, but also to convince journalists to kind of basically take your story and tell it to your audiences. So in practical matters, you should take your brand and your story and try to convey this to journalists. What should you do before you start? I think the most important bit is to decide whether the story that you have is actually newsworthy. If it is, then continue to write a press release about it. But if it's not, you might consider different ways of disseminating. We've heard about social media. We've also heard about, you might also want to consider putting it on your website. But if you decide to write a press release about it, the most important bit is to decide what your main messages are and put priorities in these messages. And obviously, you should construct the framework of your press release by your visual identity, the identity that your brand has, and if you're stuck, please go and see a similar press release that your other organizations have actually written. In terms of what you should include in the press release, I think the most important bit is actually your title, because the title usually very succinctly tells what the news of the press release is. And if you have more than one key messages or news, you should consider using a subtitle. Apart from the subtitle, the first paragraph is actually very important when you get your message across. And as you have heard from Stefania earlier, usually journalists are reading the press release from top to bottom. So chances are that they're not going to be able to read your entire press release. And if you can't really get your main message across in your first paragraph, your press release is probably going to be discarded. Use your second paragraph to put more additional details about your press release. You should always consider including a quote there, because the quotes from your organization is actually a unique opportunity for you to actually provide some of the key messages from your organization, but you also tell more information about the impact of your press release, and then use any additional paragraphs that you have to provide information which is not really important, but it should be there. And it goes without saying, at the end of your press release, you should decide to include your boilerplate and contact information so that people can contact you if they want to hear more about it. Now, you have written your press release. I want you to actually make a note about simplicity here. You should make sure that your press release is as simple as possible. And how can you achieve that? First of all, you can agree with the organization to create a dictionary. This is going to be a dictionary of the most complex terms that you're using and alternatives, simple alternatives. And you should try to use your simple alternatives in the press releases. Use also very simple and short sentences. And if you want to be very diligent, you can actually check the text of your press release with what we call readability formulas. These are formulas that you can actually find on the internet. You just copy your text and you paste it there, and they can tell you of how complex your text is. One of them, which is called the Gunning-Fox Index, gives you an idea of how knowledgeable the person needs to be in order to understand your press release. So a Gunning-Fox Index of 7 and 8 means that a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old can actually read the press release. And usually you should aim for your press release to have a Gunning-Fox Index at around 12, because more than 12 is actually very hard for people to understand. By comparison, usually the most popular magazines, something like Newsweek or Time, they're having a Gunning-Fox Index of 11. So always bear this in mind, simplicity, when you're writing your press releases. Now you have written your press release. As we heard from Stefania, one of the most effective ways to carry your kind of story across is actually calling the journalist. And you've heard from her that it's very important to be very selective as to which journalist you should be calling. By sellings, we mean exactly that, trying for the journalist to kind of give them a bit of a better kind of perspective of what the press release is about. Now, before you do that, you assemble first your list of journalists to call, and then before you call them, you should have what we call the pitch notes. In other words, why is this press release quite important? Can you give them additional information that is not included in the press release, or other reasons that they should be interested in your press release? And then please also remember to tell them other recent news for your organization. But I know that most of you might actually be asking, so when is the right time to call the journalist? And to answer that, I think what we need to consider here is a typical day in the life of a journalist, if there is one. Now, let's assume that we're talking about a journalist working in the national news. They are going to go to their office at around 9 o'clock in the morning. And from 9 o'clock until about 11 o'clock, what they are going to be doing, they're going to be scouring the news to find their press releases. So at 11 o'clock, what happens is that there is a very important meeting that they need to attend, which is called the editorial meeting. That is a meeting that they discuss with their editors the news that they have found for the day, and they decide then which of these stories they're going to be taking forward and creating articles. And then from 12 o'clock till 3 o'clock, they're going to be looking for more information and for interviews. And then from 3 o'clock till 5 o'clock, they're going to be writing their stories. So it goes without saying, if you want to speak to a journalist, you should try and do it very early in the morning from 9 to 11, because if you're not part of, your story is not part of the editorial meeting at 11, most probably it's not going to make it into the print version of the newspaper. Moving on to backgrounders leaflets, I think that the backgrounders leaflets are very, very important if you want to kind of communicate different messages to your audiences. And you create different backgrounds according to what you want to communicate, a corporate background, one that talks about the disease, one that talks about the advocacy. And there, similar rules apply. You should actually convey your story the simplest way possible according to the agreed messages, and obviously you should be using the visual identity of your brand to carry your message across. And if possible, you should use charts, you should use some illustrations, and everything that you can do to explain very difficult terms into your audiences. Another note also is that your leaflets is actually the right opportunity for you to actually include any actions for your brand or maybe fundraising opportunities. Moving on to the website, what is important with the website to remember is that it is for all audiences. Everybody can potentially go to the website and to search for more information. But the way that we read the website is not that we're starting from top to bottom. The way we read the website is that we actually scan to find information there. So what you should be doing here is that you should basically lay the information from top to bottom, and you should have the simple accessible kind of information at the top, whereas much more complex information should actually be hidden within your website. And it goes without saying that you need also to be using simple language, and you need to be using your visual identity. In terms of the web design, similar rules about branding apply here. You use your visual identity, as we said. You can use appropriate imagery and basically to try also explain their complex information by using images and illustrations. And I think you should consider also websites that are not only viewable on the computer, but in mobile-friendly devices like tablets and phones. And that was basically the entire presentation. I've talked about uniqueness and practicality. We have explored some elements that make our story unique. That is emotion, that is simplicity and creativity. And then we have investigated how we can actually take successful stories, create a brand, and along with our messaging, to carry this across into 4 different communication materials: press releases, backgrounders, leaflets, and websites. And going back to what we said at the start, I hope by in that way that we will manage to shift the balance towards communicating